I never imagined I'd be typing something like this, but here I am, writing it out because I can't stop reliving that Thanksgiving night. I thought I knew Sophia, 5 years together, and I believed I knew every little detail of her life. But that night, something shifted. She was quiet. Not the usual quiet. This was different. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, like she was lost in thought. No, it was a silence that pressed against my chest, heavy and suffocating. I tried making small talk, asking about work or the meal, anything to break the tension. But her responses were distant, hollow, like she wasn't even really there. I told myself it was just stress, but the truth was much darker, more twisted than I could have imagined. After dinner, while she was in the kitchen cleaning up, I decided to look for the wine opener in the living room drawer. Instead, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. An old photo, buried under some papers. It was of Sophia, much younger, smiling next to a man I didn't recognize. But it wasn't just any smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone you love, the kind that's intimate and knowing. A smile that belonged to someone else, not me. My stomach dropped. I showed her the photo, and her face drained of color, like she saw a ghost. She froze. She didn't just look surprised, she looked terrified. And that's when she told me about him. Her ex-husband. I had never heard a word about this man in all the years we'd been together. Not once. And yet, she told me it was just something from the past. But there was something in her eyes, something that said it was more than that. Much more. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't shake the image of the photo, the way she'd reacted, her refusal to talk about it. I couldn't stop thinking, why hadn't she told me? What was she hiding? The next morning, as she took a shower, I did something I never thought I would do. I went through her phone. I know. It was wrong. But something gnawed at me, something deep and primal that made me feel like I was losing control of something much bigger than I could understand. That's when it all fell apart. Hidden in plain sight, there were messages from him, the ex-husband. And they weren't casual. The words sent a cold, sharp stab into my chest. I'm close to resolving this. Soon, everything will be like before. What the hell did that mean? What was he going to resolve? I confronted Sophia, but she denied it all, said I was imagining things, overreacting. But when I showed her the messages, her face crumpled. It wasn't regret, not at all. It was fear. Real, raw fear. That's when she told me everything. He hadn't let go. He still thought they were meant to be together. And worse, he believed I was standing in the way. She told me she'd been trying to protect him from me. And then she said it. The words that will haunt me forever. He wants everything to go back to how it was, even if he has to take you out of the picture. My heart didn't just drop. It stopped. That night, sleep felt impossible. I lay on the living room couch, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with Sophia's words. Take you out of the picture. They replayed over and over, each time sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to believe it. Surely no one could be so extreme. Maybe it was just her exaggerating. Maybe he was just frustrated. But then, around 3 a.m, I heard it. A sound that made my blood run cold. A creaking, like someone was testing the gate. Not a casual sound. It was deliberate, like someone trying to force their way in. I rushed to the window, holding my breath, not knowing what to expect. That's when I saw him, standing on the sidewalk, not moving, just staring. His face was half hidden beneath a hood, his hands buried in the pockets of his jacket. But I knew it was him. Something about the stillness of his figure made the world feel like it had stopped, like time was holding its breath. My stomach twisted. He was watching us, waiting. The next morning, I couldn't sit still. I called a friend of mine who was a cop, explained the situation, but his advice felt empty. Stay alert. If anything looks off, call. It wasn't enough. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. Sophia was shaking, barely able to hold it together. Every few minutes, she glanced out the window or double-checked the locks on the door, as if she expected him to show up at any moment. By late afternoon, I was on edge. I couldn't just sit around anymore. I couldn't wait for him to make the next move. I grabbed the car keys and went straight to the address from the messages, the hotel where he was supposedly staying. What was I hoping to accomplish? I didn't even know. I just knew I had to do something, anything, to stop this nightmare from getting worse. When I pulled into the parking lot, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in cold hues of orange and purple. The hotel was small, run down, the kind of place you'd pass by without a second glance. I walked into the lobby, my hands trembling. I asked the receptionist for a man with the name from the messages. He eyed me for a long moment, as if deciding whether to tell me anything at all. Finally, he pointed down the hallway. Room 12. His voice was low, cautious. My heart slammed against my ribs. I could barely hear my own breath over the rush of blood in my ears. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last, like my legs were made of stone. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to forget this, but something darker, pushed me forward. When I reached the door, I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath, straining to hear anything from the other side. There was nothing, no sound, but the oppressive silence only made my nerves more frayed. I knocked. Once, twice. Nothing. I knocked harder, my fist striking the door with a force I didn't know I had in me. And then the doorknob turned. Slowly, deliberately. The door cracked open, revealing a face half hidden in shadow. It was him. Sophia's ex-husband. He wasn't surprised. That's what unnerved me the most. He didn't seem shocked to see me standing there, knocking on his door. In fact, there was a faint, almost knowing smile playing on his lips, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice low, calm, almost too calm. Before I could even process the words, he swung the door wide open and stepped back, motioning for me to come in. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn and run, but I stepped forward. Against every instinct I had, I stepped inside. The room was small, stale with the smell of old carpets and something faintly metallic. The only thing that stood out was a suitcase in the corner, its contents haphazardly strewn across the floor. Clothes, shoes, and something darker. I couldn't quite place it. And then he began to speak. And that's when everything I thought I knew about this situation shattered. He started pacing, like he was rehearsing some twisted monologue. "You know," he said, his voice eerily calm. She always had a way of leaving things unfinished. His words barely registered at first. I was still standing by the door, close enough to run if I had to, my heart thundering in my chest. "Did she tell you everything?" He continued, almost casually. "Of course not. Sophia never tells you everything. But you must have guessed she never loved you. You're just a replacement." His words hit harder than any punch, but I couldn't let myself react. My body was shaking with a mix of rage and terror, but I couldn't show it. Not yet. He kept going, his voice never rising, as if we were discussing the weather. He spoke about their plans, how they had a life mapped out, a future, until I showed up. The calmness in his voice, the detached way he spoke, was far worse than if he had been yelling. It was the calm of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and that terrified me. When I mentioned the messages, he chuckled. A low, chilling sound. "Of course, you know. I wanted you to know. You needed to understand that you don't belong to her." That's when he reached for the suitcase and pulled something out. A knife. It wasn't just any knife. It was big, heavy, something out of a nightmare, the kind that belongs in a horror movie. My legs went cold, but my mind screamed at me to run. But I couldn't. I was frozen in place, the reality of the situation finally hitting me. He held the knife in front of him, that same sickening smile still on his lips. "Do you think you can take my place? Do you think she chose you?" Dot, I took a slow step back, fingers trembling toward the doorknob, but before I could even touch it, he lunged forward, blocking the exit. Everything inside me screamed to get out. But I didn't. In that moment, something primal kicked in. I don't know what came over me, fear, desperation, or pure instinct, but I grabbed the closest chair and hurled it at him. He went down, but the knife never left his hand. I didn't think. I just acted. I leapt at him, fists flying, trying to get the knife away from him. We tumbled across the room, a blur of desperate movement, blows, and panicked screams. I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth, feel the sweat slicking my skin. I wasn't strong. I wasn't trained. But I had something else. Fear. Pure, unrelenting fear that pushed me past any sense of caution. In the struggle, the knife slipped from his grip. It clattered to the floor. He tried to crawl toward it, but I shoved him back with every ounce of strength I had. His head struck the bed's edge with a sickening thud, and he collapsed, blood trickling down his forehead. I stood over him, panting, my heart in my throat. My body trembled, not from exertion, but from what I had just done. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or terrified, but I knew I couldn't stay. I needed to get out. I grabbed the knife from the floor, feeling its weight in my hand, but I wasn't sure if I was holding it for protection or to finish what I'd started. I stepped back, watching him closely. His chest still rose and fell, but there was something in his eyes, something that felt like pure hatred. When he started to stir, I didn't hesitate. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the monster in him. I raised the knife, hands shaking, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know how many times I struck him. It all happened too fast. 1 second, he was there, lunging at me. The next, he wasn't moving. The silence that filled the room was deafening. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I stood there, staring at him, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened, what I had just done. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in my own head, before I could move. My phone was in my pocket, and I dialed Sophia's number. No answer. Panic set in. I rushed home, hoping to find some kind of explanation. When I got back, the house was empty. The lights were off, and there was a note on the kitchen table. The handwriting was hurried, frantic. It read, "I can't stay here anymore. I'm sorry." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no mention of what had happened or where she was going. Just those words. As if everything could be wiped away in a few scribbled lines. I stood there, the note crumpled in my hand, feeling a cold emptiness flood through me. The anger, the relief, everything felt hollow now. I was alone, and I knew, deep down, that my life would never be the same. Since that night, I haven't heard from Sophia, and part of me never wants to. But every night, I wake up to the feeling that I'm being watched, and no matter how many locks I put on the door, no matter how many times I check the windows, I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before one of them comes back. I've never been one to believe in things like premonitions or signs, but what happened to me last Thanksgiving made me rethink everything. It all started when I decided, somewhat on a whim, to visit my family in the countryside. The drive was about 6 hours on the highway, and I thought it would be easy to hit the road early and arrive before lunch. Not one for meticulous planning. I simply threw some clothes into a suitcase and left. The road was practically deserted, which I initially found comforting. The scenery, autumn trees lining the highway under a gray, overcast sky, looked straight out of a movie. Little did I know how surreal this trip was going to become. Around the second hour of driving, an old square-shaped car began appearing in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't pay much attention, dismissing it as a mere coincidence. But as minutes ticked by, the car became impossible to ignore. I sped up slightly, and it matched my pace. I slowed down, and it did the same. Even through tight curves that made me grip the wheel tighter, the car stayed at an uncomfortably constant distance, like a dark shadow clinging to me. A knot formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I tried to convince myself it was just my paranoia, maybe someone else going the same way. But the relentless persistence of that car made me uneasy. After a while, I decided to stop for gas. I spotted an isolated gas station by the roadside and pulled in. It was one of those places that seemed stuck in time. An old pump, the faint scent of gasoline mixing with the crisp night air, and no other cars in sight, except for that car following me. He parked a few meters behind me, his presence unmistakable. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, but when the driver stepped out, my discomfort surged into fear. He was a man in his early 40s, wearing a worn-out coat that had seen better days and sporting a smile that was anything but friendly. He approached slowly, as if stretching his legs, and began making small talk. "Beautiful night for a long drive, isn't it?" he said, his tone unsettlingly calm. He asked where I was headed and commented on how the road was perfect for a long drive. There was something unnerving about the way he acted. His persistence in conversation, the hollow smile that never faded. I gave basic answers, my voice betraying my unease. But he seemed more interested in making me uncomfortable than in any genuine interaction. As soon as I finished fueling up, I hastily got back in my car and drove away. But the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow over me. Unsurprisingly, he returned to his car and kept following me. After leaving the gas station, my heart pounded in my chest. I tried to stay calm, rationalizing that he might just be a weird guy coincidentally traveling the same route. But the less I thought about it, the less that made sense. He never attempted to pass me or maintain a normal distance. He was always close enough for me to know he was there, a constant presence haunting my every move. Desperate to shake him, I started testing the limits, taking unexpected turns, venturing onto a dirt road for a few meters, even speeding up to create distance. Nothing worked. He mimicked my every move, matching my pace with unnerving precision. My car wasn't the fastest, but I pushed the accelerator, trying to put as much space between us as possible. Only when I glanced in the rearview mirror did I see him, steadfast and unyielding, as if nothing could make him give up. As the road grew even more deserted, the situation intensified. The sky darkened further, the clouds thickening until visibility was reduced to a mere blur. Each time I looked in the rearview mirror, his car seemed to draw closer, his presence more menacing. The anxiety gnawed at me, a relentless predator stalking its prey. Could he be a robber, a psychopath, someone with a vendetta against me for some stupid reason? Thoughts raced through my mind, each more terrifying than the last. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. There was nowhere to run, the road stretching out before me like an endless tunnel, with him trailing behind every turn. I realized I needed to make a choice. Either find a way to lose him for good, or locate a safe place to stop. The decision weighed heavily on me, each second stretching into an eternity as the darkness enveloped the highway. The isolation of the countryside only amplified my fear, the silence broken only by the hum of my engine and the pounding of my heart. The yellow house on the corner, my intended destination, now seemed like a beacon for something sinister, drawing me further into a nightmare I couldn't escape. In that moment of sheer terror, I knew I had to act decisively. With a deep breath, I turned off the highway and plunged into a side road, hoping to lose him in the maze of rural lanes. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to snuff out any hope of escape. My mind raced, every instinct screaming that I was being hunted. The night air was thick with fear, and the once beautiful scenery now twisted into a backdrop for my nightmare. As I navigated the winding roads, the man's car remained a constant shadow in my rearview mirror, a silent reminder that my ordeal was far from over. I decided to speed up once and for all, even though I knew my old clunker didn't stand a chance against his car, which seemed unnervingly pristine. I pressed the accelerator until my engine groaned in protest, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I was escaping. His car vanished from my rearview mirror, and relief washed over me like waking from a nightmare. But that relief was short-lived. As I eased off the gas to navigate a sharp curve safely, he reappeared, as if materializing out of thin air. That's when I realized he wasn't just following me. He was toying with me. His ability to appear and disappear at will felt calculated, designed to keep me in a state of constant panic. And honestly, it was working. Finally, I spotted a sign indicating that the main road was just a few kilometers away. It was my only hope. I floored the gas pedal, pushing my car to its limits, hoping that the busier road would deter him, or at least draw less attention. When I reached the main road, the traffic was denser than I had anticipated. I merged directly into the flow, weaving between cars, trying to blend in. For a moment, I couldn't see him in the rearview mirror anymore, and the oppressive pressure in my chest began to ease. Still, a lingering fear clung to me, as if he was hidden somewhere, biding his time. Even after being certain he was no longer behind me, I couldn't shake the unease. Every passing car, every reflection of light in the rearview mirror seemed to be him returning. My entire body was tense, my hands slick with sweat, making the steering wheel slippery beneath my grasp. It was as if my brain refused to accept that the immediate danger had passed. The road began to look more familiar, signaling that I was nearing my parents' town, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I caught myself checking the mirrors every few seconds, expecting to see him emerge from the shadows. Even as I entered the quiet street of my parents' house, that tension remained, pulsing at the back of my mind like a relentless drumbeat. When I parked and stepped out of the car, I scanned the surroundings, almost expecting him to appear from a darkened corner. But there was nothing, just the sound of leaves rustling in the wind and the faint scent of burning wood wafting from a distant house. My family greeted me with smiles, asking why I looked so drained. I fabricated a simple excuse, claiming I was exhausted from the trip. It didn't make sense to explain what had happened, especially since, what could I say? Someone followed me and then vanished. It seemed absurd, even to me. As I walked into the house and closed the door behind me, I couldn't resist taking one last glance at the dark street. Nothing. Just silence. Yet, even today, when I think back to that night, I can't convince myself it was merely paranoia. That night, even surrounded by my family, relaxation eluded me. Every moment, I peered out the window, expecting to see headlights or hear the unmistakable roar of an engine. It was as if my mind couldn't turn off the sensation of being watched. When I went to the room that used to be mine on the second floor, I glanced out the window one last time before switching off the light. Everything appeared calm. The street was deserted, illuminated only by the yellowish glow of a lone street lamp. For a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I focused my gaze, it was just the wind swaying the branches of a tree. Still, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the house, every distant noise made me jump, prompting me to check the window repeatedly. The fear had already taken root deep within me. To this day, I don't know what truly happened on that trip. I have no idea who that man was, why he followed me, or what he wanted. No one else in my family noticed anything strange, and after the holiday passed, I returned home, trying to erase the memory. But sometimes, while I'm driving, I feel that same sensation, the heavy weight in my stomach, as if someone is lurking just behind me. Even when I glance in the rearview mirror and see nothing, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, that car is still watching, waiting to turn an ordinary Thanksgiving night into a relentless nightmare. I don't know if it was just bad luck or something far more sinister, but since that day, the road has never felt like a safe place to me. I never thought I would share this, but the memory still sends chills down my spine. It was last Thanksgiving, and while everyone else was home enjoying turkey and football, I was stuck on the night shift at the convenience store. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills. The night began quietly, with only a few customers drifting in and out. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a ticking clock filled the silent aisles. I was idly scrolling through my phone behind the counter when I noticed him for the first time. He was unremarkable at first glance, slightly disheveled, wearing a jacket that seemed too worn for the chilly November weather. He walked in without a word, wandered down the beverage aisle with a slow, deliberate pace, and left without buying anything. At the time, I shrugged it off. Strange people come through here all the time. But then he returned. About 15 minutes later, he walked in again, this time heading straight to the counter. He purchased a cheap soda and started making small talk. Initially, it was nothing out of the ordinary. He asked if the store was busy, if I was working alone. I forced a polite smile, but an uncomfortable tension settled in. He inquired if I lived nearby, what my family was doing for the holiday. When I sensed my disinterest, he said, "I saw you leaving your house this morning. You live in that yellow house on the corner, right?" My heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off, and returned to arranging magazines on the counter. He lingered for a few more seconds before departing, but the heavy feeling in my chest refused to lift. The unsettling sensation that something was terribly wrong. From that moment on, I was on edge. Every 5 minutes, I glanced out the window, convincing myself he might have just noticed me leaving the house. The store was nearly empty, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the beverage fridge. About 20 minutes later, he appeared once more. This time, he walked in slowly, without any rush, as if he were searching for something, or waiting. He didn't purchase anything, just drifted through the aisles with an eerie patience. I stood behind the counter, pretending to be engrossed in my phone, but my eyes never left him. He left again, without a word, and I knew without a doubt that something was very wrong. My heart raced, and uncertainty gnawed at me. Calling the police felt like an overreaction. He hadn't done anything overtly threatening. I texted my sister, telling her I thought someone was following me. She replied with a joke, saying I must have watched too many horror movies. Still, fear kept me on high alert. I decided to lock the door from the inside and put a "Be Right Back" sign on the window. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of knocking on the window. It was him again, standing outside, staring directly at me. He motioned for me to open the door, but I pretended not to see him, stepping back into the store. My stomach churned, the feeling of imminent danger so intense it was almost palpable. I remained behind the counter, feigning busyness while keeping a vigilant eye on him through the corner of my vision. He lingered outside for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving. The store was oppressively quiet, the silence amplified by my racing thoughts. Every minute stretched unbearably long, filled with the sound of my own breathing and the distant ticking of the clock. Then, through the reflection of the door glass, I saw something odd in the parking lot. Movement, like someone was watching us from the shadows. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone, contemplating calling the police again. But my mind was a tangled mess. What could I possibly report? A creepy man wandering nearby didn't seem sufficient justification. About 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. He was back, But this time, his demeanor had changed. More relaxed, almost casual, as if he had all the time in the world. He approached the counter directly, and before I could respond, he said something that sent shivers down my spine. "You forgot to turn off the room light before you left. I saw it from the street. You can see everything from there." His tone was unnervingly normal, making my footing falter. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to respond, but nothing came out. He smiled, a forced, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes, and then crumpled a dollar bill on the counter before turning around and leaving without another word. I stood there, paralyzed, as the door closed behind him. My mind raced, replaying his words over and over. Who was he? How did he know about the room light? The questions spiraled in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. I locked the door tighter, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone to call someone. Anyone. But fear held me back. The night continued in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of the refrigerator and my own shallow breaths. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in the back of the store, the shadows dancing on the walls, and every creak of the building amplifying my fear. The yellow house on the corner, my supposed sanctuary, now felt like a target. I didn't know how long I stayed awake, but the hours felt like days, each one filled with the dread of his return. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The mystery of that man remains unsolved, a lingering fear that something or someone could be watching, waiting to turn an ordinary Thanksgiving night into a nightmare. I never thought I would share this, but the memory still sends chills down my spine. It was last Thanksgiving, and while everyone else was home enjoying turkey and football, I was stuck on the night shift at the convenience store. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills. The night began quietly, with only a few customers drifting in and out. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a ticking clock filled the silent aisles. I was idly scrolling through my phone behind the counter when I noticed him for the first time. He was unremarkable at first glance, slightly disheveled, wearing a jacket that seemed too worn for the chilly November weather. He walked in without a word, wandered down the beverage aisle with a slow, deliberate pace, and left without buying anything. At the time, I shrugged it off. Strange people come through here all the time. But then he returned. About 15 minutes later, he walked in again, this time heading straight to the counter. He purchased a cheap soda and started making small talk. Initially, it was nothing out of the ordinary. He asked if the store was busy, if I was working alone. I forced a polite smile, but an uncomfortable tension settled in. He inquired if I lived nearby, what my family was doing for the holiday. When I sensed my disinterest, he said, "I saw you leaving your house this morning. You live in that yellow house on the corner, right?" My heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? I laughed awkwardly, trying to brush it off, and returned to arranging magazines on the counter. He lingered for a few more seconds before departing, but the heavy feeling in my chest refused to lift. The unsettling sensation that something was terribly wrong. From that moment on, I was on edge. Every 5 minutes I glanced out the window, convincing myself he might have just noticed me leaving the house. The store was nearly empty, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the beverage fridge. About 20 minutes later, he appeared once more. This time, he walked in slowly, without any rush, as if he were searching for something, or waiting. He didn't purchase anything, just drifted through the aisles with an eerie patience. I stood behind the counter, pretending to be engrossed in my phone, but my eyes never left him. He left again, without a word, and I knew, without a doubt, that something was very wrong. My heart raced, and uncertainty gnawed at me. Calling the police felt like an overreaction. He hadn't done anything overtly threatening. I texted my sister, telling her I thought someone was following me. She replied with a joke, saying I must have watched too many horror movies. Still, fear kept me on high alert. I decided to lock the door from the inside and put a "Be Right Back" sign on the window. It was then that I heard the unmistakable sound of knocking on the window. It was him again, standing outside, staring directly at me. He motioned for me to open the door, but I pretended not to see him, stepping back into the store. My stomach churned, the feeling of imminent danger so intense it was almost palpable. I remained behind the counter, feigning busyness while keeping a vigilant eye on him through the corner of my vision. He lingered outside for what felt like an eternity before finally leaving. The store was oppressively quiet, the silence amplified by my racing thoughts. Every minute stretched unbearably long, filled with the sound of my own breathing and the distant ticking of the clock. Then, through the reflection of the door glass, I saw something odd in the parking lot. Movement, like someone was watching us from the shadows. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my phone, contemplating calling the police again, but my mind was a tangled mess. What could I possibly report? A creepy man wandering nearby didn't seem sufficient justification. About 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang again. He was back, but this time his demeanor had changed. More relaxed, almost casual, as if he had all the time in the world. He approached the counter directly, and before I could respond, he said something that sent shivers down my spine. "You forgot to turn off the room light before you left. I saw it from the street. You can see everything from there." His tone was unnervingly normal, making my footing falter. My voice caught in my throat as I tried to respond, but nothing came out. He smiled, a forced, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes, and then crumpled a dollar bill on the counter before turning around and leaving without another word. I stood there, paralyzed, as the door closed behind him. My mind raced, replaying his words over and over. Who was he? How did he know about the room light? The questions spiraled in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. I locked the door tighter, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone to call someone, anyone, but fear held me back. The night continued in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of the refrigerator and my own shallow breaths. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching, lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That night, sleep eluded me as I lay in the back of the store, the shadows dancing on the walls and every creak of the building amplifying my fear. The yellow house on the corner, my supposed sanctuary, now felt like a target. I didn't know how long I stayed awake, but the hours felt like days, each one filled with the dread of his return. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. The mystery of that man remains unsolved, a lingering fear that something or someone could be watching, waiting to turn an ordinary Thanksgiving night into a nightmare. I never imagined that a Thanksgiving day could end like that. It was 2012, and as every year, my family gathered at my grandmother's old house in Wisconsin. The wooden floors creaked with every step, but there was something undeniably cozy about the place. The scent of pumpkin pie and roasting turkey wafted from the kitchen, almost masking the underlying tensions we never addressed. 14 of us were present: cousins, uncles, and Uncle Brian, who had always been the black sheep. My grandmother worked tirelessly to maintain a facade of unity, but with Brian around, it always felt like the calm before a storm. Dinner began peacefully, almost unnervingly so, given our history. Plates clinked, laughter echoed, and everyone seemed to ignore the thinly veiled strains beneath the surface. That's when my cousin Jacob, without any pretense, started provoking Uncle Brian, mocking him by saying he only showed up to eat and disappears the rest of the year. Their clashes were predictable, but Brian's inability to contain his anger was always a ticking time bomb. He remained silent for a tense few seconds, eyes fixed on his plate, as if battling an internal war. Then abruptly, he lashed out, hurling insults at Jacob, calling him a loser and a mommy's boy. The air grew thick with anticipation, and everyone sensed the impending explosion. Jacob refused to back down. He stood abruptly, sending his glass of wine cascading to the floor, and began yelling at Brian. My grandmother attempted to intervene, her voice shaky as she pleaded for calm, but her words fell on deaf ears. Without warning, Brian also stood, his face flushed with rage, fists clenched tightly. His words were venomous, dripping with contempt, and it was clear he was intent on humiliating Jacob. The atmosphere became so oppressive that even the children playing in the next room froze, their games abandoned in fear. My father tried to restrain Jacob, urging him not to engage, but Brian was relentless. He uttered something vile about my mother, something so repulsive I can't even repeat it, and Jacob completely lost control. The room erupted into chaos as the two of them began shoving each other. I had never witnessed a fight up close like this. It was horrifying. The table trembled when Brian forcefully threw Jacob against it, sending turkey and plates flying in every direction. My aunt screamed, desperately trying to get them to stop, but no one else dared to intervene. The situation spiraled further out of control when Brian, in a fit of blind rage, grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. He held it so tightly that the veins on his arm bulged unnaturally. Time seemed to slow as my grandmother stepped forward to calm him, but before she could utter a word, Brian shoved her with brutal force. She crashed to the ground, groaning in pain. I barely had time to comprehend what was happening. My grandmother lay on the floor, her breaths shallow and pained, while the room descended into utter pandemonium. My aunt rushed to her side, but Brian had transformed into someone unrecognizable, shouting incoherent threats, swinging the knife wildly. My father struggled to hold him back, but Brian's strength was terrifying, far beyond what any of us had anticipated. In a swift, horrifying motion, Brian turned the knife on my father, slashing his arm. The sickening sound of flesh tearing through skin echoed in my ears as blood splattered across the kitchen floor. Panic set in as someone yelled to call the police, But amidst the chaos, no one could reach their phone. My older brother, Michael, attempted to approach from behind to disarm Brian, but it was a disastrous mistake. Brian spun around, catching Michael with a vicious strike to the shoulder, the knife embedded deeply. Fear gripped me as I realized there was no escape. We were trapped inside the house with him. The nauseating mix of spilled food and blood filled the air, making it hard to breathe. My mind raced, thoughts spiraling. How is this happening to my family? And Dad? While all this was happening, the children huddled in the corner of the room, their soft sobs barely audible over the escalating chaos. My mother rushed to their side, her voice trembling as she tried to coax them out. But Brian seemed omnipresent, his rage enveloping every corner of the house. He moved with a predatory grace, advancing on anyone who dared approach. My grandmother, still lying on the floor, pleaded with him to stop, her voice cracking with desperation. But it was as if Brian couldn't hear her. His eyes were hollow, devoid of any trace of the man we knew, an eerie emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. Aunt Louise, her face pale and determined, grabbed a chair as a last resort. She swung it wildly at Brian from behind, but he was unnervingly swift. In a blink, he spun around, the chair missing her by inches before delivering a brutal strike. She crumpled to the ground, pain etched across her features, and the room seemed to close in tighter around us. I wanted to do something, anything, but my legs felt like they were anchored to the floor. Fear rooted me to the spot, making every second stretch into an eternity. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake. The sound of sirens was a distant promise, but time dragged on agonizingly slow as Brian's violence escalated. He paced the house like a relentless predator, muttering incoherent threats that sent waves of dread through us. The air was thick with fear, making it hard to breathe as we awaited the inevitable. Suddenly, Brian stopped pacing and stood in the center of the room, his gaze fixed on us with an intensity that froze us all. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the preceding screams, a heavy stillness that seemed to press down on our very souls. He was breathing heavily, the knife still clenched in his hand, lost in a dark reverie. Jacob, even with his injured shoulder, crawled desperately toward the door, but Brian's eyes locked onto him, and he advanced once more. In a split second, my father, clutching his bleeding arm, shoved a bookshelf into the doorway, creating a temporary barrier. It was just enough time for Jacob to reach the doorknob and fling the door open. Panic surged as we all bolted for the exits, some stumbling over debris, others fleeing in sheer terror. The sound of police sirens finally pierced the night, growing louder as we sprinted across the lawn. I ran without looking back, hearing muffled screams and the thud of Brian's footsteps behind us. When the officers arrived, everything happened in a blur. Shouts, more screams, and then an eerie silence. They rushed in, taking Brian into custody, his knife still gleaming with blood. He stood motionless, an unsettling calm replacing the fury that had consumed him. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The house was in ruins, food scattered everywhere, blood splattered across the floor, and chairs overturned in disarray. My grandmother, father, and Michael were whisked away by ambulances, their injuries severe but survivable. Aunt Louise didn't make it. The paramedics covered her with a white sheet. Her lifeless form, a stark contrast to the vibrant family gatherings we once cherished. The sight of her being taken away felt like the final fracture in our already shattered family. I felt a void inside me, struggling to comprehend how our lives had been upended in an instant. Brian was placed in the police car, his expression vacant and unrepentant, the knife still embedded in his hand. He didn't show remorse or anger, just an eerie emptiness that lingered in my mind long after the officers had left. During the interrogation, Brian remained mostly silent, his words sparse and cryptic. He kept repeating that they deserved it, leaving us to ponder who they were and why he targeted us so brutally. Some speculated that he had been planning the attack for years, waiting for the right moment to unleash his fury. Others believed he had a mental breakdown, unable to control his violent impulses. The lack of clear answers only deepened the horror, leaving us with more questions than solutions. What terrifies me the most is the realization that Brian was one of us. The same man who had shared childhood memories with my father, laughed at jokes during our dinners, and was an integral part of our family fabric. That night, he transformed into something unrecognizable, a predator hiding in plain sight. The ambiguity of his motives and the abruptness of his violence haunt me to this day, a constant reminder of how fragile peace can be and how darkness can reside within those we trust the most. Thanksgiving always felt like a blur of laughter and clinking plates, the outside world drowned by the constant buzz inside. But that year, something was different. As I stepped onto the porch, the air felt heavier, cooler somehow. Across the street sat a black sedan, its presence oddly silent amidst the usual chaos. The car looked nondescript, yet there was something unsettling about its stillness. I caught myself staring longer than I should, the hum of conversations fading into a tense quiet. Maybe someone was lost, I told myself. Thanksgiving is a mess. With a reluctant shake of my head, I went back inside, pushing the image of the car to the back of my mind. Inside, the house was alive as always. Children darting through rooms, adults exchanging boisterous stories, the kitchen a whirlwind of aromas and piled up dishes. But as the evening waned and guests began to depart, that uneasy feeling crept back. I wandered to the living room window, and there it was. The black sedan, unmoved, its presence more oppressive the second time around. My heart skipped when I noticed a shadow near the streetlight pole on the sidewalk. It was vague, almost blending with the darkness, but unmistakably human. The figure stood there, eyes locked on our house, and for a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Then, as if aware of my gaze, the person turned and vanished around the corner, leaving only the lingering chill. I lingered by the window, hoping it was a figment of my imagination, but nothing stirred. Returning to the living room, I tried to join the remaining guests, helping to gather plates with a jittery unease I couldn't shake. When I passed through the kitchen to take out the trash, a final glance toward the car froze me. The stranger was gone from the sidewalk, but an unsettling certainty told me they were still nearby. Deciding to confront my fear, I didn't mention anything to anyone. I grabbed a flashlight, its beam cutting through the fading light, and approached the car. Each step felt heavier, my pulse pounding in my ears. The sedan was empty, the interior spotless, eerily so. Then I saw the footprints, dark impressions leading from the car toward the back of the house, fresh and deliberate. A knot tightened in my stomach as I turned to go inside, but something compelled me to look one last time. Inside, the back door was ajar, a violation of our usual routine. My mother always made sure everything was locked before dinner. Heart racing, I turned the key, the metal cool and unyielding in my hand. As I pushed the door shut, my gaze fell on the garden. More footprints crisscrossed the dirt, irregular and frantic, leading straight to one of the first-floor windows. The realization settled over me like a dark cloud. Someone had been watching, and now they were closer than I ever wanted to believe. My mind raced, every thought tangled with fear and disbelief. I sprinted upstairs, the wooden steps groaning under my weight, desperate to check the rooms without drawing attention. At first glance, everything seemed in place, the familiar clutter of our home untouched. But when I pushed open my bedroom door, my breath caught. The underwear drawer lay open, garments strewn across the floor in a disordered heap. It wasn't random. Someone had been rummaging through my personal space. My stomach twisted into knots, confirming the worst. Someone had broken into our house while we were distracted by dinner. Heart pounding, I dashed down the stairs, trying to steady my racing pulse. In the corner, I grabbed my sister, whispering urgently about what I'd seen. She chuckled nervously, suggesting maybe a child had accidentally climbed in, but her laughter faltered when I mentioned the footprints in the garden. We exchanged worried glances and decided to inform our parents. My father dismissed it with a forced smile, attributing my fears to paranoia, yet he agreed to inspect the house with a flashlight. I retreated to the kitchen, a swirl of fear and frustration boiling inside me. Who would dare invade our home on a holiday meant for togetherness? As my father stepped outside, the night seemed to close in around me. Then, a sound from the basement sliced through the tense silence, a dry, unsettling creak, like old wood settling. I glanced at my mother in the living room. Her face mirrored my unease. Summoning every ounce of courage, I approached the basement door. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, but it refused to budge, leaving me in oppressive darkness. I took a deep breath and descended 2 creaky steps, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the blackness. That's when I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, echoing in the confined space. Spinning around, I found my father standing there, flashlight in hand. He motioned me back, his face tense. "It's locked down there. There's nothing," he said. But his eyes betrayed a hidden fear. I forced a calm demeanor, though my mind was a whirlwind of panic. The open drawers, the garden footprints, the basement noise. It all felt interconnected, a sinister web tightening around our family. My father insisted we call the police, and my mother finally relented, her voice quivering with concern. As we waited, the house felt colder, the walls pressing in. Everyone gathered in the living room, seeking comfort I couldn't find. But an insistent pull drew me back to the garden, a need to see for myself if there was any truth to my fears. I slipped out the back door, the night air sharp against my skin, and approached the footprints with renewed scrutiny. The damp soil made each step distinct, the patterns unsettlingly irregular. They wove past the kitchen window, leading toward a small side entrance I rarely used. My pulse quickened as I followed them, the beam of my flashlight revealing more disturbed earth. Then I spotted it, a crumpled piece of paper lying against the wall, almost concealed by shadows. My hand shook as I picked it up, the ink smudged in the darkness. The message sent a shiver down my spine. I'm closer than you think. I'll come back when no one is watching. Dropping the note, I stood frozen, the weight of its meaning pressing down on me. Realizing the nightmare was far from over, I stood frozen, staring at the crumpled piece of paper in my trembling hands, feeling as though it might combust from the weight of its message. My first instinct was to retreat inside. With shaking fingers, I bolted back into the house, the back door slamming shut behind me. Heart pounding, I approached my father, thrusting the note toward him. His usually steady hands trembled as he took it, reading silently. My mother hovered nearby, phone pressed to her ear, her face draining of color as she absorbed the words. Without a word, she ended the call and dialed the police again, her fingers fumbling over the buttons with urgency. Meanwhile, an unsettling feeling gnawed at me. The intruder could still be lurking somewhere on our property, watching, waiting. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in with each passing second. When the police finally arrived, the night had settled into an eerie silence. Their flashlights swept the perimeter, casting long, shifting shadows across the yard. They methodically checked every door and window, even the basement, but found nothing beyond the ominous footprints and the chilling note. The older officer tried to comfort us, suggesting it might have been a prank by some misguided teenager or someone who mistook our address. But I knew deep down it was far more sinister. How could someone know our routine, break in so meticulously, and leave a message that felt all too personal? After the officers left, an oppressive silence enveloped the house. The few remaining family members hurried to leave, their discomfort palpable. My mother attempted to mask her fear with a strained smile, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the wind against the window, every snap of the floorboards, amplified my anxiety, as if the house itself was whispering warnings of an unseen presence. I don't know exactly when exhaustion overtook me, but I was jolted awake by an overwhelming sense of being watched. My heart thudded violently as I glanced around the dark room, realizing with a start that the curtain was open. I was certain I had closed it before lying down. I approached the window, every step heavy with dread, and peered outside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the gnawing feeling that something was wrong persisted, gnawing at my nerves. In the days that followed, fear became a constant companion. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, my hands constantly checking locks and peering through windows. The note's message echoed in my mind, a persistent reminder of the threat that loomed over us. Whoever had done this knew too much, had invaded our privacy in a way that felt deeply personal. The lack of answers, the uncertainty of their motives, made the experience all the more terrifying. Each night, the shadows seemed to lengthen, and the silence was filled with the unspoken fear that the nightmare was far from over.